The message arrived on a dull Thursday afternoon while I was running routine security checks. There was no prior argument, just a single cold text severing all the effort I had freely given them over the past 10 years. They honestly thought I was just a useless gatekeeper to be tossed aside. They entirely forgot exactly who holds the sole master key to that entire empire. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Harper Watson. The hum of the servers at the Nova Grid Systems Network Operations Center was a constant low drone that usually brought me a sense of profound peace. I sat in my dimly lit office, the glow of 3 large monitors casting a harsh blue hue across my minimalist desk. It was just another dull Thursday afternoon right around 2 o'clock. I was in the middle of running routine security diagnostics, my fingers rhythmically tapping across the mechanical keyboard, completely unaware that my entire family dynamic was about to be obliterated with a few keystrokes. My phone buzzed against the solid wood of the desk. It was a harsh vibrating sound that shattered my absolute focus. I glanced down at the screen. It was a message from Evelyn, the woman I was supposed to call my mother. I picked up the device, my eyes slowly scanning the dense block of text she had just sent. Harper, we have finally secured a major technology partner. We no longer need your services, nor do we want to deal with your constant negativity and controlling behavior anymore. We are moving forward without you. Do not contact us again. Consider our ties completely severed. Before I could even begin to process the absolute finality and sheer coldness of those words, a second notification popped up on my screen. This one was from Chloe, my younger sister. Her message dripped with the kind of venomous arrogance she had always harbored, but kept slightly hidden until now. Guess who just got a massive upgrade? We are finally free of you holding us back. Our new financial partner has a whole team of real experts. Have a nice life rotting in your dark little server cave. The silence in my office felt incredibly heavy for a fraction of a second. Most normal people would have dropped the phone in shock. Most people would have cried, screamed, or felt the sharp, agonizing sting of ultimate betrayal. After all, this was my own flesh and blood casually discarding me like yesterday's trash and telling me I was permanently dead to them. But as I sat there staring intently at the harsh pixels on the screen, I did not shed a single tear. My chest did not tighten with grief. My hands did not shake. Instead, a strange, overwhelming sense of relief washed over my entire being. It felt exactly as though a massive, suffocating weight that I had carried on my shoulders for over 10 years had suddenly evaporated into thin air. For a full decade, I had bled for that family. I had spent countless sleepless nights entirely sacrificing my weekends, my personal relationships, and my holidays to meticulously build the entire logistics distribution algorithm for our family company from the ground up. I did it completely free of charge. I received zero financial compensation, no equity, and barely a thank you. I did it simply because I foolishly believed in the concept of family loyalty. I firmly believed that my sweat and my code were the unbreakable foundation of our shared legacy. Evelyn and Chloe had gladly taken the fruits of my labor, using my flawless system to route thousands of daily deliveries, optimize massive supply chains, and build their shiny little empire while keeping me in the shadows. They honestly thought it was just that simple. In their technologically illiterate minds, they believed that just because they had signed a lucrative contract with some faceless corporate tech partner, this new team of so-called experts could just waltz in and seamlessly take over my complex system. They assumed the code was just a generic machine that anyone could drive. They completely forgot, or perhaps never even bothered to understand, that my algorithm was a living, breathing entity that I had uniquely designed with my own proprietary architecture. It was not a simple plug-and-play toy, and it most certainly did not belong to them. I set my phone face down on the desk, cutting off their digital existence. I stood up slowly, my movements highly deliberate and utterly devoid of any panic or frantic energy. I walked over to the heavy oak door of my office and firmly turned the deadbolt lock. A loud, satisfying click echoed in the quiet room. I was completely isolated now, securely locked away with my machines exactly where I belonged. Returning to my leather chair, I shifted my undivided focus back to the central monitor. I opened a highly secure encrypted terminal. My fingers steady and cold as absolute ice began to type the complex access protocols to the family company's main data storage servers. The terminal immediately prompted me for the highest level master credentials. I entered the 64-character alphanumeric passphrase perfectly on my very first try. The screen flashed a brilliant green. I was fully inside their system. The sheer audacity of their betrayal was almost poetic. They had handed me the knife and eagerly bared their own throats, fully believing they were completely invincible. I silently navigated through the root directories, my eyes tracking the millions of lines of code that dictated the absolute lifeblood of their entire corporate operation. The sheer apathy inside me was terrifyingly absolute. They wanted me gone. They demanded my absence from their perfect newly funded lives. I was about to give them exactly what they asked for. I bypassed the standard user interfaces, diving straight into the back-end architecture. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I called up the supreme administrative dashboard of the central algorithmic system. This was the absolute highest tier of access, a digital command center, built exclusively by me and for me. The screen shifted from standard directories to a complex web of live data streams, thousands of active delivery routes, real-time warehouse inventory matrices, and automated driver dispatch protocols pulsed across the monitors in a steady rhythm of green and white text. I watched the system hum with perfect efficiency. It was a masterpiece of digital engineering, managing an unfathomable volume of daily logistics. But the beauty of being the sole architect is that you know exactly where the foundational pillars stand, and more importantly, you know exactly how to demolish them. Before executing any command, I opened a separate encrypted directory to review the legal documentation. I pulled up the proprietary software licensing terms. Exactly 3 years ago, when the company first started scaling aggressively, Evelyn had demanded I integrate a highly complex predictive routing module. I built it, but I also quietly registered the copyright and all underlying intellectual property strictly under my own personal legal name. I scrolled through the digital vault, running a comprehensive query for any signed documentation binding my software to their corporate entity. The search returned 0 results. There was absolutely no intellectual property transfer agreement, no corporate assignment of rights, and no employment contract stipulating that my code belonged to the company. To them, my work was just an expected family contribution. Legally, however, they were merely operating on a conditional, informal, and entirely unpaid usage license. They were tenants in a digital skyscraper that I owned outright. And the landlord had just been formally evicted from her own family by the very tenants she was housing. Their aggressive messages demanding I never contact them again constituted a definitive termination of our informal operational arrangement. With the legal boundaries crystal clear in my mind, I initiated the official revocation protocol. I navigated to the core authorization matrix. As the sole legal proprietor of the software, I began drafting a system-wide override command to immediately revoke the algorithm usage license due to a catastrophic breach of our implied cooperation agreement. I typed the command strings with surgical precision. Every keystroke was a deliberate act of severance. I was not hacking them. I was not planting a virus. I was simply taking back my property. I routed the command through the primary node, targeting the authentication layer that allowed their servers to communicate with my proprietary routing logic. A glaring red confirmation screen materialized in the very center of my primary monitor. It displayed a stark warning detailing that executing this override would instantly sever all core connections. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I decisively pressed the Enter key to terminate all core system access. I leaned back in my leather chair and watched the digital cascade unfold. Within exactly 30 seconds, the entire ecosystem collapsed. The vibrant green data streams representing thousands of active delivery orders froze instantly. Error codes began populating the dashboard in rapid succession. Cascading failure warnings flashed wildly as the central algorithm was entirely ripped away from the user interface. Their multi-million-dollar logistics platform, the crown jewel of their precious new corporate partnership, had just been transformed into a hollow, completely unworkable shell. Without my central brain, their shiny application was nothing more than a useless graphical interface staring at a blank void. The digital execution was flawless. Now it was time to finalize the personal severance. I picked up my phone, navigating directly to my contact list. I found Evelyn first, dragging her profile to the block list. Then came Chloe, her arrogant message still sitting in the notification tray. I blocked her immediately. Finally, I located the number for Marcus, my father, a man who had stood silently by while his wife and younger daughter cast me out. I selected his name and blocked him too. I placed the phone back onto the desk. The intense quiet of my secure office returned, but this time it felt entirely different. It was not just the quiet hum of servers anymore. It was the absolute impenetrable silence of total detachment. I sat there in the calm glow of the monitors, breathing in the crisp, cool air of my office, savoring the absolute power of knowing that the empire they so desperately worshipped was currently burning to the ground. And they did not even realize the match had already been struck. The fallout did not happen immediately. Complex digital infrastructures like the one I had meticulously built possess localized data caches, essentially buffering the illusion of functionality for a short, deceptive window. But exactly 48 hours later, the mathematical inevitability of a total network collapse came crashing down upon them. It was a beautiful, entirely predictable implosion. I sat in the absolute quiet of my apartment, sipping a warm cup of black coffee, calmly watching the localized operational status maps on my personal laptop. One by one, the glowing green nodes representing healthy regional hubs flickered, choked on the missing code, and turned violently red. The family company's user-facing delivery application, the sleek and modern interface they loved to show off at industry galas, was now completely paralyzed. Without my proprietary routing logic actively processing the continuous back-end requests, the application simply timed out, throwing endless fatal error screens to deeply frustrated end users. The real-world physical consequences were even more satisfying to monitor from a distance. Thousands upon thousands of perishable and highly time-sensitive orders were hopelessly trapped at various regional distribution centers. Independent contractor drivers were sitting entirely idle in loading bays across the state, unable to receive their digital manifests or generate any navigation waypoints. The massive warehouses were rapidly overflowing, creating a monumental logistical bottleneck that was undeniably bleeding them tens of thousands of dollars by the hour. Their customer service phone lines were undoubtedly melting down under the weight of furious vendors and buyers. It was a complete and utter operational paralysis. Since I had firmly blocked all of their personal phone numbers, their mounting desperation began bleeding into my professional communication channels. A relentless, chaotic flood of electronic mail started hitting my secondary work inbox. I watched the subject lines populate in real time on my screen. They came from various unknown corporate addresses clearly belonging to the new so-called technology experts they had bragged so arrogantly about hiring. The tone of the incoming messages tracked a perfectly predictable psychological curve. The first few batches were frantic but somewhat professional, begging for emergency consultation access and pleading for me to provide a temporary patch to fix the routing loops. Within 12 hours, as the reality of their incompetence set in, the panic mutated into raw, unhinged aggression. The messages were now filled with empty threats of massive corporate lawsuits, criminal prosecution for digital sabotage, and unyielding demands for immediate system restoration. You have exactly 1 hour to revert the system architecture, or our legal team will destroy you permanently. Read one particularly pathetic message from a supposed senior project manager. I simply highlighted the entire domain and routed it straight to my digital trash bin without sending a single reply. Let them scream their empty threats into the void. By the evening of the second day, the mounting pressure clearly became far too much for my younger sister to contain behind closed doors. Chloe took her fabricated grievances directly to the public arena. Using an anonymous dummy account, I quietly monitored her primary social media feeds. She had posted a highly produced, tearfully dramatic video. She sat right in the middle of her pristine designer living room, gently dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue, playing the ultimate victim for her hundreds of thousands of followers. She spun a pathetic, incredibly convoluted narrative about being maliciously sabotaged by a deeply toxic and jealous family member who was actively trying to destroy her career right at the very threshold of her greatest monumental success. "We just wanted to grow our vision," she sobbed pathetically, directly into the camera lens. "And someone who is supposed to love us unconditionally, deliberately, burned our entire livelihood to the ground out of pure, unadulterated spite." The comment section beneath the video was a predictable echoing chamber of blind support and intense outrage directed at an unnamed villainous sister. It was a spectacular performance of absolute delusion. She was begging strangers for sympathy, while her family's stolen empire choked on its own monumental hubris. I felt absolutely no urge to defend myself or engage with her highly manufactured public drama. I completely ignored every single transparent provocation. Getting dragged into a messy public mudslinging contest was exactly what they desperately wanted to distract from the failing technology. Instead, I remained entirely detached, functioning purely as a silent observer gathering critical intelligence. I shifted my analytical focus entirely away from the social media circus and began rigorously scrubbing through public corporate compliance portals, state business registries, and obscure financial filing databases. I was methodically looking for the real underlying reason behind their sudden vicious need to purge me from the ranks with such extreme prejudice. It took me several uninterrupted hours of digging through dense financial disclosures and newly formed shell-holding companies to finally find the smoking gun. They were not merely swapping out a technology vendor for a slightly better financial deal. The truth was far more insidious and deeply greedy. I discovered that my family was actively attempting to sell the entire company outright to a massive multinational rival conglomerate. They were maneuvering to offload the business for a massive buyout, and my presence, or more specifically my undocumented ownership of the core technology that made the company valuable, was the only obstacle standing between them and a lifetime of unearned generational wealth. I knew I had hit the absolute limit of my own investigative capabilities regarding corporate law. The labyrinth of holding companies' tax havens and obscured financial structures required a very specific type of predator to navigate successfully. I picked up my phone and dialed the private number of my closest friend Julian. He was a ruthless, highly sought-after commercial attorney who specialized in complex corporate mergers and hostile takeovers. "I need you at my apartment immediately," I told him the moment he answered. "Bring your encrypted laptop and every single backdoor access token you have to the state business registry." He did not ask any pointless questions or demand an explanation. He simply said he would be there in exactly 20 minutes. When Julian arrived, he tossed his heavy leather briefcase onto my dining table and immediately began setting up his workstation right next to my own array of glowing monitors. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly tense, thick with the unspoken understanding that we were hunting for something monumentally ugly. I quickly briefed him on the sudden brutal expulsion, my subsequent system shutdown, and my initial findings regarding their secret negotiations with the massive rival conglomerate. Julian simply nodded, his sharp eyes already scanning the dense walls of text on his screen. "If they are actively trying to sell an entity whose sole market value relies on an asset they do not legally own," Julian muttered, his fingers flying across the keys in a blur of motion, "they are trying to pull off a multi-million-dollar fraud right under the nose of a corporate giant. Let us see how deep this rabbit hole goes. For the next 3 hours, we sat shoulder to shoulder, silently tearing through layers of obfuscated digital paperwork. Julian utilized his premium legal database subscriptions to entirely bypass the standard public viewing restrictions. We meticulously tracked the digital footprints from their newly formed shell company all the way to a highly confidential pending merger docket awaiting final regulatory approval. The sheer scale of the proposed deal was absolutely staggering. The acquiring corporation was offering a payout of nearly $50 million. It was a sum that would guarantee unearned generational wealth for anyone involved. But as we dug deeper into the heavily redacted annexes of the primary contract, the true depth of my family's depravity began to surface like a rotting corpse in a pristine lake. "Harper," Julian said suddenly, his voice dropping an entire octave, completely drained of its usual cynical amusement. "Look at Appendix Section 4, Subsection B, the intellectual property and asset disclosures." I leaned over my eyes, locking onto the document he had just pulled up on the high-resolution screen. It was a digital scan of a comprehensive legal affidavit. The title proudly declared it to be a master transfer and assignment of all proprietary software rights. I read through the dense legal jargon, feeling a cold, sickening dread pooling in the very bottom of my stomach. The document explicitly stated that I, as the original software architect, was willfully and permanently transferring 100% of the intellectual property, including all underlying source code patents and operational copyrights, directly to the family corporation for absolutely zero financial compensation. It falsely claimed I was doing this as a voluntary familial contribution to secure the legacy of the business. But that was not the horrifying part. I scrolled down to the final page, my breath catching violently in my throat. Right there, scrawled across the designated vendor signature line in dark blue ink, was my name. It was my exact signature, perfectly replicated, dated exactly 4 weeks ago. "That is a complete forgery," I stated. My voice was a dead, hollow sound in the quiet room. "I never saw this document. I never signed it. They forged my signature to steal my entire life's work." Julian leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. "They are actively defrauding the buyers on a massive scale. They are presenting this blatantly forged document as ironclad proof of absolute ownership to close the sale. This is not just a messy family dispute anymore, Harper. This is a massive federal crime carrying severe prison time." We kept digging, fueled now by a dark, adrenaline-fueled anger. The most brutal revelation was still waiting for us, buried deep within the complex financial structuring of the proposed cash payout. Julian traced the intricate routing numbers designated to receive the massive final settlement. The funds were not going into the primary corporate accounts. They were not even being split evenly between Evelyn and Marcus. According to the binding structure of the merger contract, every single cent of that $50 million purchase price was scheduled to be wired directly into a newly established, irrevocable offshore private trust fund. I checked the beneficiary registry of that specific trust. There was only one single name listed: Chloe. They were planning to sell the entire company, pocket all the cash exclusively through my spoiled younger sister, and dissolve the original corporate entity entirely to avoid taxes. But the absolute worst part was the liability clause hidden at the very bottom of the agreement. Because they were dissolving the company, any future catastrophic system failures, legal breaches, or operational lawsuits resulting from the software would fall directly back onto the original creator, me. They were going to walk away with tens of millions of dollars, leaving me holding the bag for every single legal disaster when the system inevitably crashed or required complex updates I was no longer providing. They were effectively digging a massive financial grave, pushing me inside, and preparing to bury me alive, just so Chloe could live in absolute luxury for the rest of her life. Staring at that screen, staring at the cold, undeniable documented proof of their calculated, deeply malicious intent, something fundamentally snapped deep within my chest. It was not a loud, dramatic break. It was a quiet, permanent severing of a heavily frayed rope. Any lingering pathetic illusions I still held about the sacred nature of blood, ties any tiny shred of daughterly affection or sisterly duty, evaporated into complete irreversible nothingness. They were not my family. They were ruthless parasites who had fed on my brilliance for a decade and were now actively conspiring to destroy my entire future for a massive payout. I turned to Julian, my face set like carved marble, devoid of any hesitation. "I want to absolutely ruin them," I said simply, the coldness in my voice surprising even myself. "I do not want to just quietly stop the sale. I want to trap them so deeply in their own vicious lies that they never see the light of day again." Julian smiled, a slow, highly predatory grin spreading across his face as he closed the document file. "Then let us prepare a very special kind of hell for them." There was absolutely no room left in my mind for fiery rage or explosive emotional outbursts. Anger is a remarkably sloppy emotion. It makes you careless, loud, and entirely predictable. Instead, I retreated into a state of absolute icy hyperfocus. Over the next 12 hours, Julian and I transformed my apartment into a fully functional corporate war room. I methodically began compiling an impenetrable fortress of physical and digital evidence. I printed out the original digitally timestamped source code architecture from 3 years ago, placing it right next to the officially sealed government copyright certificates bearing my legal name. Then we extracted high-resolution copies of the forged intellectual property transfer document from the pending merger file. Julian brought in an independent forensic handwriting expert. He kept on retainer, who quickly provided a sworn affidavit, confirming beyond a shadow of a doubt that the signature on the transfer was a blatant, malicious forgery. With the weapon fully loaded, it was time to aim it directly at the heart of their precious buyout. We did not alert the acquiring conglomerate's public relations team or their executive board. Executives often try to cover up messy situations to push a lucrative deal through. Instead, Julian specifically targeted the true gatekeepers of any massive corporate merger, which was the Internal Risk Assessment and Legal Compliance Department. I drafted a highly sterile, purely objective legal summary outlining the exact ownership status of the core algorithmic routing technology. I attached the certified copyright registrations, the forensic forgery analysis, and a clear, undeniable demonstration that the current operational platform was utterly paralyzed because the legitimate owner had permanently revoked the usage license. We packaged this devastating digital bomb into a highly encrypted, untraceable file and sent it directly to the personal inboxes of the top 3 senior compliance officers at the rival conglomerate. We knew exactly how corporate lawyers operated. The moment they saw undeniable proof of a multi-million-dollar fraud and massive impending litigation, they would instantly slam the brakes on the entire acquisition. The silent trap was officially set. Now I needed to lure the rats out of their sinking ship. I walked down to a local convenience store and purchased a cheap prepaid burner phone with cash. I needed a completely untainted line of communication to reach out to them, one that would not compromise the absolute digital blockade I had established on my personal devices. Sitting in my car, I carefully drafted a text message to Evelyn and Marcus. It needed to sound exactly like a desperate surrender. I had to feed their massive egos to ensure they would show up. I cannot handle the legal threats and the public humiliation anymore. I am willing to discuss a full system restoration and formally transfer the administrative keys. Meet me at the Horizon Executive Center Boardroom number 4 tomorrow morning at exactly 10 o'clock. We can end this. I hit send and waited. It took less than 5 minutes for a reply to flash across the cheap screen. It was from Evelyn, and it was dripping with exactly the kind of toxic, triumphant arrogance I had meticulously counted on. "It is about time you finally came to your senses and realized who holds the real power in this family. We will be there. You had better have the entire system fully operational the moment we walk through that door, or our lawyers will proceed with the criminal sabotage charges." A cold, deeply satisfied smile crept across my face. They actually believed I was terrified. They honestly thought their empty threats, and Chloe's pathetic social media crying had completely broken my spirit. Their blind, towering hubris was the exact mechanism that would guarantee their total destruction. The following morning, Julian and I arrived at the Horizon Executive Center a full 2 hours early. It was a high-end neutral corporate rental facility located in the financial district, far removed from the territory of their failing company. We had specifically booked the most intimidating room available. Boardroom number 4 was a massive sterile expanse of cold glass, dark polished mahogany, and harsh bright overhead lighting. It felt less like a meeting room and far more like a high-security interrogation chamber. We moved with quiet, practiced efficiency. Julian unpacked his heavy leather briefcase, meticulously arranging 4 thick black binders on the smooth surface of the massive conference table. Each binder contained the complete, undeniable chronology of their fraud. I walked over to the multimedia podium and connected my secure laptop to the room's primary display system. I lowered the heavy automated blinds, plunging the room into a tense cinematic gloom, and fired up the massive overhead projector. The screen against the far wall illuminated with a stark, blindingly bright display. It was the live administrative dashboard of their beloved logistics application. The numbers were catastrophic. Active deliveries sat at absolute zero. Regional hub statuses were entirely red. At the very center of the massive projection, flashing in a continuous, unforgiving loop, was a bold system warning indicating that the master architecture was permanently locked due to severe intellectual property violations. Everything was completely perfect. The trap was flawlessly baited. The exits were entirely sealed, and the absolute reality of their impending doom was glowing on the wall right in front of the empty chairs. I took my seat at the far end of the long mahogany table, folding my hands neatly in front of me. Julian sat immediately to my right. His posture relaxed, but his eyes incredibly sharp, like a hawk patiently watching a field. The heavy digital clock on the wall silently ticked toward 10 o'clock. We sat in the cold, immaculate silence, perfectly ready to welcome my family to their very own execution. Exactly at 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy mahogany door of boardroom number 4 swung open. Evelyn marched in first, carrying her designer handbag like a weapon. She was dressed in a pristine white power suit, radiating the toxic, unearned confidence of a woman who believed she had already won the war. Marcus followed closely behind her, his posture rigid, trying to maintain the facade of a stern patriarch. Finally, Chloe sauntered into the room. She was wearing a smug, triumphant smirk, her eyes completely devoid of any genuine remorse. They did not even glance at the massive screen displaying the locked system warnings. They only looked at me. "I am glad you finally decided to stop throwing your little childish temper tantrum," Evelyn announced, her voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. She did not bother to sit down. She simply stood at the opposite end of the long table, glaring at me with absolute disdain. "You have caused us an unacceptable amount of stress over the last 2 days. Turn the system back on immediately. And frankly, Harper, we expect a formal written apology for this ridiculous stunt before we even consider letting you back into the building." Chloe leaned against the leather chair next to her mother, crossing her arms. "You almost ruined my big week," she chimed in, her tone dripping with venomous entitlement. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to have my investors calling me because our delivery application is down? Just press the stupid button and fix it, so we can all move on with our lives." I did not offer a single word of argument. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not apologize. Instead, I calmly picked up the small remote control resting on the table and pressed a single button. The projection on the far wall instantly shifted. The locked administrative dashboard vanished, replaced by a massive, high-resolution image of the master intellectual property transfer document. The forged signature, blown up to be 5 feet wide, glowed in bright blue ink right in the center of the room. The smug smirk instantly dissolved from Chloe's face. Evelyn stopped speaking mid-breath. Marcus physically recoiled, his eyes widening in sudden absolute terror. "What you are looking at is a major federal crime. Julian stated, his voice smooth, but incredibly lethal. He picked up one of the thick black binders from the table and tossed it heavily toward them. It landed with a loud, echoing thud. We hired an independent forensic handwriting expert, the best in the entire state. They analyzed the ink pressure, the digital timestamps, and the stroke patterns. They have already sworn under oath in a legally binding affidavit that this signature is a blatant, malicious forgery. But we did not stop there, did we, Harper? I pressed the remote button a second time. The screen transitioned to a highly detailed financial flowchart. It traced the exact routing of the proposed $50 million buyout. The diagram clearly showed the funds bypassing the primary corporate operating accounts entirely. Instead, the money was being funneled directly into an offshore, irrevocable private trust fund established in the Cayman Islands just 3 weeks ago. At the very top of the trust structure, printed in bold, undeniable black letters, was the sole beneficiary name, Chloe Watson. "You really thought you were all so incredibly clever," I said, finally breaking my silence. My voice was a soft, deadly blade slicing through the heavy, suffocating air of the boardroom. "You planned to steal my entire life's work. You conspired to forge my legal signature to sell my property to a massive rival conglomerate. You intended to hide all $50 million in a secret private trust for your precious, spoiled youngest daughter. And the absolute worst part, you deliberately structured the dissolution of the company to leave me holding every single ounce of the legal liability when the software inevitably required massive updates you could not provide." All the vibrant color rapidly drained from Evelyn's face, leaving her looking completely hollow and deeply aged. Her expensive white power suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. Marcus started trembling violently, his hands gripping the edge of the polished mahogany table just to keep his knees from buckling beneath him. The silence in the room was no longer born of their usual arrogant superiority. It was the crushing, paralyzing silence of absolute exposure and imminent destruction. But here's the greatest surprise of all. I continued savoring the taste of every single carefully enunciated syllable. "You are not getting a single dime from that buyout. Early yesterday morning, Julian and I compiled a comprehensive legal packet. We sent it directly to the senior risk assessment and compliance officers at your prospective corporate buyer. We provided them with the certified government copyright registrations, proving I am the sole owner of the core technology, along with the undeniable forensic proof of your forged transfer document." Marcus let out a pathetic, strangled gasp, sounding like a man who had just been violently punched in the stomach. "No," he whispered, his entire successful corporate patriarch facade crumbling into absolute dust right before my eyes. "You did not do that. You could not have." "I absolutely did," I replied coldly, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "And their general counsel responded precisely 1 hour ago. The conglomerate has officially and permanently withdrawn from the acquisition. The entire deal is completely dead. Furthermore, because you maliciously attempted to defraud a publicly traded entity during a multi-million-dollar negotiation, their massive legal team is currently preparing to file severe federal fraud charges against all 3 of you. The litigation fees alone will completely drain your personal bank accounts long before you even step foot inside a criminal courtroom." Panic, raw and completely unfiltered, finally exploded across the room. Marcus suddenly lunged forward, collapsing entirely to his knees beside the heavy wooden table. He looked up at me, bitter tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning any remaining shred of human dignity. "Harper, please," he begged, his voice cracking wildly as he reached out toward me. "Please, you have to save us. Just sign a real legitimate transfer document right now. We can go back to their lawyers. We can tell them it was just a massive internal family misunderstanding. If you do not sign it, the company will go totally bankrupt by the end of the week, and your mother and I will go to a federal prison. Please, I am begging you. I am your father." I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling on the floor in his expensive tailored suit. I searched my heart, waiting for that familiar tug of familial obligation or daughterly guilt. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, no regret. Just a profound, quiet emptiness that felt remarkably like total peace. You stopped being my father the very moment you decided to bury me alive just to make her rich, I said quietly, gesturing toward Chloe, who was now collapsed in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably into her shaking hands. I smoothly gathered my documents, sliding them back into my secure leather briefcase. I am not signing a single thing to save any of you. In fact, right after the deal completely collapsed this morning, I reached out to your largest market competitor. They spent the last 3 hours reviewing my proprietary architecture, and they officially offered to buy the software outright for exactly $100 million. And because I own it completely free and clear, I will be keeping every single penny of that money for myself. Julian and I turned our backs on them and calmly walked toward the heavy glass door. Behind us, the boardroom suddenly erupted into absolute violent chaos. Evelyn started screaming furiously at Marcus at the top of her lungs, viciously blaming his incompetence for the entire catastrophic failure. Chloe was wailing loudly, her lifelong dreams of unearned luxury wealth permanently shattered into a million sharp pieces. The sound of their desperate, miserable fighting, tearing each other apart, echoed loudly down the sterile corporate corridor. I simply kept walking, my head held high, never once looking back at the burning wreckage. Exactly 6 months later, I sat comfortably by the massive floor-to-ceiling window of my brand-new luxury penthouse apartment, taking a slow sip from a glass of incredibly expensive red wine. The sprawling city skyline sparkled brilliantly against the deep night sky, a sea of endless possibilities. On the large flat-screen television mounted across the living room, the evening financial news anchor was just finishing a brief corporate segment. They were reporting on the total humiliating bankruptcy and permanent asset liquidation of Novagrid Systems, right alongside the breaking news of the pending federal fraud and embezzlement indictments against its disgraced former executive board. I took a slow, deep cleansing breath, savoring the absolute pristine silence of my beautiful home, finally enjoying the sweet, permanent taste of total and complete freedom. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Violet Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.